The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe, complete audiobook. I neither expect nor wish to be believed in the most extraordinary and yet most familiar story I am about to relate. In a case where my senses refuse to accept their own testimony, I should be really mad if I believed it so. Yet I am not mad, and I am certainly not dreaming. But I may die tomorrow, and I should like to ease my mind today. My immediate desire is to show the world clearly, concretely, and without comment, a series of simple domestic events which have terrified, tortured, and stupefied me by their consequences. I will not, however, attempt to explain them. They have hardly produced any other feeling in me than horror, but to many people they will seem less terrible than Baroque. Perhaps later there will be an intelligence that will reduce my phantasm to the status of a commonplace. Some intelligence more serene, more logical, and much less excitable than mine will find in the circumstances that I relate with terror only a normal series of causes and the most natural effects. The docility and humanity of my character struck me from my childhood. So remarkable was the tenderness of my heart that I had made myself the plaything of my friends. I had a real passion for animals, and my parents allowed me to possess a great variety of favorites. I spent nearly all my time with them, and I was never so happy as when I was feeding or caressing them. As I grew older, this peculiarity of my character increased, and when I grew to be a man, I made it one of my principal sources of joy. Those who have professed affection for a faithful and sagacious dog do not require an explanation of the nature or intensity of the joys which it can produce. There is something in the disinterested love of an animal, in the sacrifice of itself, which goes straight to the heart of him who has often had occasion to experience the mean friendship and the fragile fidelity of natural man. I married young. I was fortunate in discovering in my wife a disposition similar to my own. Having noticed my fondness for these domestic favorites, she lost no opportunity of providing me with the most agreeable kind. We had birds, a gold-colored fish, a magnificent dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This last animal was very strong and beautiful, entirely black, and of wonderful sagacity. My wife, who was at heart somewhat superstitious, spoke of its intelligence by frequently referring to the old popular belief that all black cats were disguised witches. This does not mean that she was always serious on this subject, and I mention it simply because I remember it. Pluto, that was the name of the cat, was my favorite friend. I was the only one who fed him, and wherever I went he followed me around the house. I even had a hard time stopping him from following me down the street. Our friendship thus continued for some years, during which my character and temperament, I blush to confess, underwent a most fatal alteration through the demon of intemperance. From day to day I became more taciturn, more irritable, more indifferent to the feelings of others. I used brutal language towards my wife, and in time even afflicted her with personal violence. Naturally, my poor favorite must have noticed the change in my character. Not only did I not pay any attention to them, but I even abused them. Yet as for Pluto, I still had enough regard for him not to strike him. On the other hand, I had no scruples about mistreating the rabbits, the monkey, and even the dog, when by chance or affection they crossed my path. But my evil was taking hold of me, for what evil admits of a comparison with alcohol? As time went on, Pluto himself, who was growing older and naturally a little surly, began to feel the effects of my perverse character. One evening, as I was returning home, completely drunk from one of my frequent haunts in the neighborhood, it seemed to me that the cat was avoiding my presence. I took it, but it, horrified by my violent attitude, made a slight wound on my hand with its teeth. A demoniac fury suddenly took hold of me. At that moment I ceased to know myself. It seemed as if my original soul had suddenly left my body, and a superdemoniac vileness, saturated with gin, seeped into every fiber of my being. From my waistcoat pocket I took a penknife, opened it, took the poor animal by the throat, and deliberately gouged out one of its eyes. I blush, I sting, I shudder as I write this abominable atrocity. When at daybreak I had recovered my senses, and the vapors of my nocturnal debauchery had dissipated, I felt a feeling of half horror, half remorse for the crime I had committed. but at most it was a weak and equivocal feeling, and my soul did not suffer its attacks. I sank again into excess, and soon drowned in wine all memory of my deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye was, it is true, frightful, but after a while he seemed to take no notice of it. As was his wont, he went up and down the house, but as I ought to have guessed, as soon as he saw me approach him, he would flee in terror. I still had enough of my old heart left to be afflicted by this manifest antipathy in a creature who had once loved me so much. But this feeling was soon driven out by irritation. As if to my final and irrevocable downfall, there arose the spirit of perversity, a spirit of which philosophy takes no care. Yet, as surely as my soul exists, I believe that wickedness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of those indivisible first faculties or sentiments which direct the character of man, who has not often caught himself doing some foolish or vile act, for no other reason than that he knew he ought not to do it. Have we not a constant inclination, in spite of the excellence of our judgment, to violate what is the law, simply because we perceive it to be the law? I say that this spirit of wickedness was to bring about my entire ruin. The living and unfathomable desire of the soul to torment itself, to violate its own nature, to do evil for the sake of evil, impelled me to continue, and ultimately to carry out, the torture I had inflicted on the harmless beast. One morning, in cold blood, I fastened a noose about his neck and hanged him from the branch of a tree. I hanged him with my eyes full of tears and with my heart overflowing with the bitterest remorse. I hanged him because I knew that he had loved me, and because I knew that he had given me no cause to be angry with him. I hanged him because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin, a mortal sin, which would so compromise my immortal soul as to place it, if that were possible, far from even the infinite mercy of the most terrible and merciful God. On the night following the day on which so cruel an act was committed, I was awakened from my sleep by the cry of "Fire!" The curtains of my bed were on fire. The house was a great blaze. Not without great difficulty did my wife, a servant, and I escape from the blaze. The destruction was total. I was ruined, and from that time on I gave myself up to despair. I do not attempt to establish any connection between cause and effect in regard to the atrocity and the disaster. I am above such weakness, but I am merely giving an account of a chain of events, and I do not wish to omit the smallest link. I visited the ruins on the day after the fire. Except for one, all the walls had fallen down. The only exception was a thin inner partition, situated almost in the middle of the house, against which my bed rested. Here the structure had largely withstood the fire, a fact which I attributed to its having been recently renovated. Around this wall the crowd was gathering, and a number of persons were examining a portion of it with keen and minute attention. My curiosity was aroused by the words "strange," "singular," and other such expressions. I came closer and saw, like a bas-relief carved on the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The image was copied with truly marvelous accuracy. A rope was encircling the animal's neck. Scarcely had I seen this apparition, for I could regard it as nothing but an apparition, when my astonishment and terror were extraordinary. At last reflection came to my aid. I remembered that the cat had been hanged in a garden adjoining the house. At the cries of alarm, the garden was immediately invaded by the crowd, and the animal must have been taken down from the tree and thrown into my room through an open window. This was doubtless done in order to awaken me. The collapse of the remaining walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the freshly spread plaster. The lime from the wall, combined with the flames and the ammonia from the corpse, produced the image as I saw it. Although I thus soon satisfied my reason, if not entirely my conscience, yet the astonishing incident which I have just related did not fail to impress upon my imagination a deep impression. For some months I could not rid myself of the ghost of the cat, and during all this time a sort of feeling akin to, though not quite so, remorse arose in my soul. I even lamented the loss of the animal, and looked about me, in the miserable hovels which I then frequented, for another favorite of the same species and of similar features to take its place. I was sitting one evening, half-dazed, in a vile tavern, when my attention was suddenly attracted by a black object, which lay on the top of one of the immense gin or rum barrels which formed the chief furniture of the room. I had been looking up at the top of the barrel for some moments, and was surprised not to have noticed the object upon it. I went up to it and touched it. It was a huge black cat, as corpulent as Pluto, whom it resembled in every respect but one particular. Pluto had not a white hair on his body, but on this one there was a broad, white, though indefinitely shaped mark, which covered nearly the whole region of his chest. I'd hardly put my hand on it when it suddenly stood up, purring loudly, rubbed itself against my hand, and seemed pleased with my attention. It was, then, the animal I was looking for. I hastened to propose to the owner that I should buy it, but he had no interest in the animal. He neither knew it nor had he seen it before. I continued to pet him, and when I was about to return home, the animal was willing to follow me. I allowed him to do so, and leaning over from time to time, we walked towards my house, petting him. When he arrived home, he felt as if it were his own, and quickly became my wife's best friend. For my part, a dislike for him soon began to form in me. It was, therefore, precisely the opposite of what I had expected. I do not know how or why this happened, but his evident tenderness angered me and almost wearied me. Gradually, these feelings of disgust and annoyance increased into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided his presence. A sort of shame and the recollection of my former cruelty prevented me from ill-treating him. For some weeks I abstained from striking him or treating him violently, but gradually, insensibly, I came to feel an inexpressible horror for him, and to silently avoid his odious presence, as if I were fleeing from the plague. What undoubtedly increased my hatred for the animal was the discovery I made the next morning after I brought it home. Like Pluto, it too had been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, contributed to make it more agreeable to my wife, who, as I've already said, possessed much of that tenderness of feeling which was once my characteristic trait and the frequent source of my simplest and purest pleasures. The affection which the cat showed me, however, seemed to increase in direct proportion to my hatred of him. With a tenacity which the reader cannot understand, he constantly followed my steps. As soon as I sat down, he would crouch under my chair or jump upon my knees, covering me with his frightful caresses. If I rose to walk, he would sneak between my legs and almost knock me down, or else, digging his long, sharp claws into my clothes, he would climb up them to my breast. At such moments, even if I had wished to kill him with a blow, I was partly prevented from doing so by the recollection of my first crime, but above all, I hastened to confess, by the sheer terror of the animal. This terror was not positively that of a physical illness, and yet I should find it very difficult to define it otherwise. I am almost ashamed to admit it. Even in this criminal's cell, I'm almost ashamed to admit that the horror and terror which the animal inspired in me had been increased by one of the most perfect fancies imaginable. My wife had not infrequently called my attention to the character of the white spot of which I have spoken, and which formed the only perceptible difference between the strange animal and the one I had killed. The reader will doubtless remember that this mark, though large, had originally been of an indefinite form, but slowly, gradually, by imperceptible phases, which my reason long strove to regard as imaginary, it had at length acquired a rigorous definiteness of outline. It was then the image of an object which made me shudder to name. It was, above all, what made me regard it as a monster of horror and disgust, and what, had I dared, would have driven me to get rid of it. It was now, I say, the image of an abominable and sinister thing, the image of the gallows. Oh, gloomy and terrible machine of terror and crime, of death and agony. I was then, indeed, a wretch beyond the possible misery of mankind. A brute beast whose brother I had slain in contempt, a brute beast engendered in me, a man formed in the image of the Most High, such great and intolerable misfortune. Alas, neither by day nor by night did I know the peace of rest. Not for a single moment during the day did the beast leave me. And at night, every moment when I awoke from my dreams full of indefinable anguish, it was only to feel the warm breath of the thing on my face and its enormous weight, the incarnation of a nightmare that I could not separate from myself, and that seemed eternally lodged in my heart. Under such torments, the little good in me succumbed. Infamous thoughts became my innermost thoughts, the darkest, the most infamous of all thoughts. The sadness of my habitual humor increased until I detested all things and all humanity. My wife, however, never complained. Alas, she was my usual shoulder to cry on, the most patient victim of the sudden, frequent, and untamable expansions of a fury, to which I certainly abandoned myself from then on. On a domestic errand, she accompanied me one day into the cellar of an old building where we had been forced to live in poverty. The cat followed me up the steep steps of the staircase, and having tripped my head, exasperated me to the point of madness. Seizing an axe and forgetting in my fury the childish terror that had so far restrained my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal, which would have been fatal if I had struck it as I had intended. But my wife's hand stopped the blow. A rage more than diabolical produced in me at this intervention. I freed my arm from the obstacle that restrained it and plunged the axe into her skull. My wife fell dead instantly without uttering even a groan. After the horrible murder had been committed, I immediately and resolutely endeavored to conceal the body. I found that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without running the risk of the neighbors finding out. Various plans came to my mind. I thought for a moment of cutting up the corpse and throwing the pieces on the ground. I then resolved to dig a pit in the floor of the cave. Then I thought of throwing it into the well in the garden. I changed my mind and decided to pack it in a box like a piece of merchandise in the usual manner, and to have a messenger take it from the house. But at last I stopped at a plan which I considered the most feasible. I resolved to wall it up in the cellar as monks are said to have done in the Middle Ages with their victims. The cave seemed to have been built specifically for such a project. The walls were not built with the usual care, and had recently been covered over with a layer of plaster that did not allow moisture to harden. On the other hand, there was a projection in one of the walls, made by an artificial chimney or sort of fireplace, which was afterwards covered up and arranged in the same manner as the rest of the cellar. I had no doubt that it would be easy to remove the bricks from that place, place the corpse in it, and wall it up in the same manner so that no eye could discover anything suspicious. My calculations did not deceive me. With the aid of a lever, I easily separated the bricks, and after carefully applying the body to the inner wall, I held it in this position until I could restore the whole structure to its original state without great effort. With every imaginable precaution, I took care of a mortar of lime and sand, prepared a layer that could not be distinguished from the original, and scrupulously covered the new partition with it. When I had finished, I saw that everything had been done perfectly. The wall did not show the slightest sign of repair. With the greatest care, I swept the floor and picked up the debris, looked around triumphantly, and said to myself, "At least here my work has not been in vain." My first thought then was to seek out the beast which had been the cause of this terrible misfortune, for I had at last resolved to kill it. Had I been able to find it at that moment, nothing could have prevented its fate. But it seemed that the artful beast, at the violence of my anger, had become alarmed, and was trying not to appear before me, in defiance of my ill humor. It is impossible to describe or imagine the intense, peaceful sensation of relief which the absence of this detestable creature brought to my heart. It appeared all night, and this was the first I had enjoyed since its entrance into the house, sleeping peacefully and soundly. Yes, I slept with the weight of that murder on my soul. The second and third days passed. My executioner did not come, however. Like a free man, I breathed once more. In his terror, the monster had left those parts forever. I was never to see him again. My joy was infinite. I was little troubled by the criminality of my dark deed. A sort of inquest was instituted, which did little to further the investigation. An examination was also arranged, but of course nothing could be discovered. I considered my future happiness assured. On the fourth day after the murder, a group of police officers unexpectedly arrived at my house and again carried out a thorough search of the premises. However confident of the impenetrability of the hiding place, I did not experience any disturbance. The policemen desired me to accompany them in their search. Every nook and cranny was searched. For the third or fourth time, they finally descended into the cave. I was not in the least agitated. Like a man resting in innocence, my heart beat peacefully. I paced the cellar from end to end, folded my arms over my breast, and paced up and down indifferently. Fully satisfied, the police were preparing to leave the house. The joy in my heart was too intense for me to repress it. I felt the strong need of saying a word, just one word of triumph, and making doubly evident their conviction of my innocence. "Gentlemen," I said at last as the constables mounted the stairs, "it is a great satisfaction to me that your suspicions have been allayed. I wish you all good health, and a little more courtesy. By the way, gentlemen, you have a house built here." I scarcely knew what I was talking about, in my furious desire to say something deliberately. "I can assure you that this is an excellently built house. These walls— Are you going away, gentlemen? These walls are built with great solidity." Then, in a frantic bravado, I struck hard, with a stick which I had in my hand at the moment, precisely upon the wall of the partition, behind which lay the wife of my heart. Ah! May God at least protect me and deliver me from the clutches of the archdemon. Scarcely had the echo of my blows sunk into silence when a voice answered me from the depths of the grave. It was first a complaint, veiled and subdued like the sobbing of a child. Then, immediately, it swelled into a long, loud, continuous, utterly abnormal and inhuman scream, a howl, half horror, half triumph, such as can only come from hell, a horrible harmony that issues in unison from the throats of the damned in their tortures and from the demons who rejoice in damnation. It would be madness to express my feelings to you. I felt myself fainting and staggering. I fell against the opposite wall. For a moment the policemen stood still on the steps, terror having struck them. A moment later, 12 strong arms attacked the wall, which fell to the ground with a blow. The corpse, already much disfigured and covered with coagulated blood, appeared rigid to the eyes of those around. Upon his head, with its red jaws dilated and its one eye flaming, sat the odious beast whose cunning led me to murder, and whose telltale voice delivered me to the executioner. I had walled the monster up in the tomb. End of The Black Cat.